Okay, so I think we might start, and I'm just going to give a short introduction, John, before you begin. So thanks everyone thanks everyone for joining. We've had a really phenomenal response to this talk, and I think that's really reflective of the interest in this bird, in the trim, not just in the trim area, obviously in a wider sense. Personally, it's actually a bird that I wouldn't really know much about myself. Coming from Meath, I mean, I would be more familiar with buzzards and sparrowhawks and other sort of birds of prey like that. But to find out that we have this bird, in one of our biggest towns in Meath, flying around the area, it's quite an exciting thing, to be honest. It really is. So I just thought that with all this sort of publicity around this bird, as we mentioned in our statement, it was something that we had been keeping quiet, and the reasons for that we'll go through, and John will also highlight as well. But we really do, the format for this as well, we wanted it to be a bit more open, so we don't want you to just be observing a talk. We really want you to partake in it, and that's why the idea of the questions and answers session came about. So please, no question is a stupid question. Every question that you might have about this bird is valid and legitimate. I mean, I'm going to have plenty of questions myself, so if you don't talk up, I will. But honestly, we would really like your questions, and if you feel uncomfortable speaking, then we would be happy. Obviously, I'll be taking note of them in the chat. So with that, I'm going to stop talking. John Lusby is Birdwatch Ireland's Raptor specialist. He's going to give a short talk about the bird of prey, and then, the Peregrine Falcon, and then we're going to go from there with questions and answers. So John, if you want to take it away.
Thanks very much, Paul. That was a great introduction, and just say thanks to yourself and also to Terry and Frank for inviting me to talk this evening. And it's a pleasure, and I was also delighted to hear about the most famous residents of Trim now. I think the worst kept secret. So I was delighted to hear that the pair are taking up residence in Trim and have nested successfully. And as well, it's just amazing to see the turnout here and the interest that the birds have generated kind of online and via social media. And with that, as Paul said, that has also generated a lot of questions about the birds, and that's why we're here this evening. And I think we all want to appreciate and enjoy the birds, which is and it's a fantastic opportunity to do so, given their nesting in such a public location. And at least I think there's not many other birds that are as magnificent to observe than Peregrine Falcon. So to have the opportunity to for somebody to witness that in your doorstep is just phenomenal. And so the point of this evening is so we can all together kind of learn how to do that, how we can appreciate them, but also how we can avoid disturbances so that they do come back, that they do continue to nest to nest at that site. And to do that, it's really good to learn a bit more about them. So as Paul said, I'm going to give a short talk. I'm not well known for giving short talks, but I'm going to make a special point of it this evening. So going to keep the actual presentation to a minimum, and then open it up to an open discussion. And as Paul said, the only stupid question is the one you don't ask. So hopefully then, hopefully I'll be able to answer them. But yeah, after the talk, then basically we can talk about all things the trim peregrines as well as peregrines generally, and I'm sure there'll be loads to get through then in the open discussion. But firstly, I'm just going to give a very brief talk about the birds, and I will admit it's going to be hard to keep it brief just because with peregrines there's loads to talk about, but as I say, I'm going to keep the discipline. So firstly, I'm just going to show you a clip of the birds. If any aren't overly familiar with peregrines, this is a little bit of footage from a pair that I was quite familiar with a few years back, and it's actually from a quarry in Dublin. Some of you might be aware of it. It's similar, I suppose, to the pair at Trim. It was a fairly public site, fairly well known, and also because of that, it was an amazing sight to watch the birds, because they were very tolerant to people. They were used to seeing people. It was quite a busy area, and they're just absolutely amazing birds to watch, and particularly, you know, when you're watching them in this mode, when they're in breeding mode, when they're, you know, you can see the chicks there, the still with the fluffy down, and both adults there, you know, raising the chicks. So absolutely amazing bird to watch, both like this and also when they're in hunting mode. I think it doesn't get more spectacular when it comes to predators than peregrine falcon. So this is the bird in all its glory, and it is, I suppose, when I think of peregrine falcon anyway, I think they are the epitome of speed and power combined. And I think if you were given a blank canvas and asked to design a bird for both speed and power, I think if you were to do it right, you'd land on this. You'd land on peregrine falcon there. So you can see they've got quite broad, long and broad wings. Very powerful flyer, obviously, but also agile in flight. And there's a bit of a size difference, as there is in all falcons, between the male and the female. And so the male is the smaller of the two, and it's quite noticeable actually when you see them together. The male is about 2/3 the size of the female. So the female is much more muscular bird, much more kind of barrel chested. Her head looks a little bit smaller because the body is that bit bigger. The male is a bit more sleek looking, and you can see powerful downturned bill, and then very, very powerful talons, and that's where that's their main hunting tool really when it comes to catching the prey, which is mostly other birds, mostly on the wing. And I'm just going to play you. It would be far better than to show you than me describing. I'm going to play you a short clip of a peregrine in hunting mode, because it really is. And this is from the RSPB, and this is amazing footage, which is very difficult to get, of a peregrine stooping, which is hunting behavior. If any of you are used to watching them, you can hear the frenzy in the background, which is the typical response of other birds when a peregrine arrives in the scene. And now this is it entering into its characteristic stoop. All happens very fast, but it's so that basically their hunting mode is they actually go up very, very high in the air, and from there they spot their prey. They fix on the prey that they're going for, and then they go into that stoop, which is where they tuck their wings in and they basically shoot through the air like a bullet. And they are the fastest animal on the planet, and so that diving stoop has been recorded at well over 200 kilometers an hour. So it's absolutely amazing, and they're such adapted predators for that. So they actually have they've got the nostrils are especially designed to allow them to breathe. If you can imagine, if you were, if you stuck your head out the window, traveling at 200 kilometers an hour, it's very difficult to breathe. So that they've actually, their nostrils are especially designed so that they can breathe still while flying at that speed, while drooping through the air. And then it's their talons, which are really powerful. They, with clenched talons, that's what they strike the prey with if they are successful, and essentially kill them on impact. So amazing absolutely amazing hunters, amazing to see them in hunting mode. And then most of they mostly feed on birds, and there would be a bit of variation because of the size difference between the male and female in terms of the species that they would go for, and it would range right from small birds right up to the birds like feral pigeon, wood pigeon, and even small duck. So a pretty diverse range of birds that they would go for, and it kind of depends as well, what's available locally. Birds nesting by the coast would go for seabirds, whereas birds inland, say they're trim, could feed a lot on the likes of corvids like jackdaw and rook, and also wood pigeon and the likes. And also that they are an incredibly successful species, and they're one of the most widely distributed birds of prey, and then they have an almost global distribution, as you can see here. So they actually nest on all continents except for Antarctica. And the peregrine in Latin actually means the wanderer. And in Ireland, it's not the case. Our birds are residents, so they can move, from breeding season to outside the breeding season, but quite small distances. Whereas in other parts of their range, they migrate, they travel massive distances. So say, for example, in the States, you can have peregrines which nest, very far north up in the Arctic tundra, and then and that's during the breeding season, and then they migrate south to spend the winter in South America. So massive distance, whereas our birds are much more sedentary, are resident. But across the range, they're typically site faithful. So that means that, even the birds that migrate substantial distances, they typically come back to the same nest site year after year and make that, long migration to come back to the very same nest site. And we see that at nest sites in Ireland as well, whereby, there's nest sites which are known to have held peregrines for decades now, or some that, previously held peregrines and then they've been absent for a period of time, but now, birds are back, after an absence of sometimes significant periods, several decades, which is fantastic to see. So that means that with your birds there, Trim, the hope is that, they obviously did well. They raised chicks, which are, fledged at this stage. So, and are going to start to move off quite soon. But the hope is that that the adult birds, the parents will be back there again and nesting there again next year. So I suppose looking at the global distribution also, though, that's the situation now, and we don't have to go that far back in time when things were drastically different in terms of peregrine populations, in terms of their distribution, and also in terms of their in terms of their abundance. And I'm going to focus now more so on Ireland and the UK. And this is the map from the first breeding atlas, the breeding bird atlas. I'm sure some of you would be familiar with it, which is essentially a survey of all birds across Ireland and Great Britain. And there's been 3 breeding atlases carried out to date, the first of which was in the late 70s, the late 60s, early 70s. And you can see the areas where peregrine were recorded breeding in Ireland and in the UK. And you can see that there's not a lot going on in Ireland in particular. And, there's virtually no peregrines, across most of the Midlands, and they're confined to, kind of a few upland areas and coastal areas. And it was at this time really that the peregrine populations were almost decimated. And it's not an exaggeration to say that they came close to the brink of extinction. And that was not only in Ireland, but across their global range, effectively. And the main reason for that, it was due to persecution, but also due to the use of DDT, which are pesticides, organochlorine pesticides. And peregrines were very much the first canary in the coal mine. And it was actually through studies on peregrine that we really got to grips and really realized just the negative effects of these pesticides. So DDT, they were pesticides which were introduced in the 1950s, and they were used, they were widespread in agriculture after they came on the market to control pests, essentially to increase production, to increase crop yields, and also to control insects that spread malaria. And it took quite a while for us to realize just the effects that DDT and other pesticides such as DDT were having. What happened were they were accumulating in the food chain. So right from birds and insects that were birds that were feeding on seeds and on insects, and therefore peregrines were affected because obviously then they would feed on birds. So these they would bioaccumulate, and they were persistent in the food chain, which means that they take a long time to break down. And this has happened so many times. We've seen it time and time again, whereby we notice these effects then in top predators such as peregrine falcon, and that's where really the effects accumulate. And because typically predators such as peregrine falcon typically occur in low densities, when their population started to plummet, then it became quite obvious over a fairly short period of time. And what was happening was the birds, it could cause direct mortality, but the main effects was actually, it was causing the peregrine's eggs the eggshell to thin, because it affected the normal production of calcium. So essentially peregrines were were breeding, they were laying the eggs, and then but then the eggs just weren't viable. They'd crack before the chicks could hatch. So over a short period of time, the productivity of peregrines, took a nosedive, and we saw that with very, very dramatic population declines, and across the developed world, essentially, across Europe and also in the United States. And as I said, not an exaggeration to say that they were that they were coming close to extinction at that time. As I say, it was through studies that linked the effects of DDT to peregrine, and then we kind of we realized just the effects that these pesticides were having, not only on top predators but throughout the food chain in general. And it did take some time for them to be phased out and subsequently banned in the 70s and even into the early 80s. But once they were banned, then we've seen what has been the kind of slow population recovery of peregrine falcon, which has been fantastic to see. And as I say, this is the breeding atlas in the late 60s, early 70s. This was the situation then in the late 80s, early 90s, which was, kind of during the peregrine population recovery. As you can see, they were turning up in more areas and re-establishing in areas that they were lost from, in the 2 decades previous. And then the most recent atlas, 2008 to 2011, you can see the situation looks even better again. And as I say, it's definitely, they're not without their problems and without facing other pressures and threats, which we'll talk about. But in general, it's been so positive to see peregrines again return to the skies and return to areas where they've been absent for recent decades. And definitely for me, alongside the recolonization of the buzzard, alongside the great spotted woodpecker arriving, little egret, recently crane, I think that the increase in peregrine population is definitely one of the the huge conservation positives, of the last decade or two. And now we're seeing that with birds turn up in areas just like with yourselves there at Trim, areas where people where people mightn't be that familiar with them, where they haven't been for some time, and also even in situations where people may not expect them, in somewhat urban locations, and on man-made structures. And that's becoming quite common now, and we actually have them in a lot of our cities and towns, as well as, I'll show you some examples, but as well as old ruined structures, castles, tower houses as well, just in throughout the Midlands and away from the coast, which is fantastic to see. And so there was a survey carried out in 2017, led by the Irish Raptor Study Group, and it estimated the peregrine population at 425 occupied territories throughout the country. And this shows the map of the current known distribution, well, at least as of 2018, which was used for Article 12 reporting. So essentially reporting on the status of all breeding birds to the European Commission. And this is the situation with peregrine, which again, overall positive, fantastic to have to see the population increase, but there still are problems, there still are pressures and threats, which I'll talk about, and we have to be honest about, and also careful about when it comes to situations like this, like with the birds nesting in Trim, that are obviously common knowledge now. So to give you an idea then of some of the other places they nest. So the peregrines, and I suppose particularly when the population had declined dramatically, some of the last remaining peregrine sites were those that were coastal nesting pairs, so nesting on essentially sea cliffs, sea stacks like this here, nesting on the offshore islands, particularly along the west coast. And these are classic peregrine sites. As I say, some of these place names are called after peregrines. They've been there for decades and decades. And this is another one in the west coast here. This is Irene O'Brien, who's peregrine expert in Ireland, who does a huge amount of work on them. But also, as well as the coastal sites, they also nest in inland quarries right throughout the country, and essentially which are inland cliffs. And with peregrines, as I'm sure some of you noticed with the birds in trim, they can, once they become used to a certain amount of disturbance, they can very much tolerate that. And you can see here, this is an active quarry. We have peregrines nesting in active quarries, you know, where as long as the nest site itself is protected, you know, the quarry can be quite busy, a lot of coming and going, even blasting in certain parts. And as long as the birds, the nest site, as I say, is protected, then the birds will continue to use it. So quarries are a very important nesting site, and now increasingly so. Buildings such as this are becoming important for peregrine, and I have a bit of a fetish for ruined buildings when it comes to wildlife, when it comes to checking them for different wildlife like peregrine, barn owl, kestrel, raven, swift, and it's just amazing from my perspective to see, you know, buildings that I would be, you know, very familiar with, check year after year, and then all of a sudden, you know, peregrines show up and establish there, and then, you know, they're there year after year, and even in the last couple of years, it's been amazing, and there's been so many examples just like the one there in Trim, whereby birds are showing up in buildings like this, which are, you know, quite rural and, you know, quite isolated, but also, you know, buildings in busy areas, in towns and cities, you know, sometimes, built buildings, you know, right within city centres, and they typically go for high buildings, and once it itself is, you know, free from disturbance, then the birds seem to be happy. And as long as they have suitable nest site and good food availability, then, you know, they seem to do well. And these castles, tower houses can be absolutely ideal for peregrines. This is an example of one here, and this is part of the work that some of the National Parks and Wildlife Service rangers do, which is monitoring peregrines both in the west, in Galway, Mayo, and also over in the east, in Wicklow, Wexford, and Laois. And you can see this is an example of a peregrine nest where there's 3 chicks. They're just nesting in on the stairwell of a derelict tower house, and you can see, actually interesting, looking at the platter of prey remains in front of them, and so these birds seem to be almost specialising on corvids, taking a lot of jackdaw in particular, a lot of rook. So the diet can be quite varied, and again, depending on what's locally available to them. There's an example of in another year, and you see the prey remains. This is a noisy and clearly well-fed chick that you can see. And any familiar watching peregrines are probably familiar with that sound as well. They can be very, very vocal species as well, which can be, kind of put them in harm's way as well, because a lot of raptors, they can be quite difficult to find the nests, whereas peregrines just seem to immediately give the game away, and they are very, very vocal in terms of alarm calling. And if they're not happy with your presence in an area, they will make sure you know about it, and they'll repeatedly alarm call, which can make their presence quite obvious. But there are many other, you know, quite public sites. When I say public, I suppose quite either well known or also nest sites, you know, that are, you know, quite close to human habitation, or, you know, quite close to, you know, to busy urban areas. This is another one at Poolbeg again, which is very well known, and also increasingly peregrines are taking to high buildings within city centres, within towns, just like there at Trim, just on the outskirts of Trim. But and actually looking at the studies carried out by the likes of Irene O'Brien and O'Donnell here in the west, and Damien Clark and Anne Fitzpatrick, it's seeming to be the case that in certain years the birds are actually more productive, you know, in these urban areas compared with the more classic, you know, kind of upland or coastal areas that peregrines would inhabit, and that can be related potentially to food supply. If you think of an urban area like this, you know, with an abundance of pigeons, as long as there's suitable nest sites, they can be really, really good areas for peregrine, and we're seeing them, you know, taking up these sort of areas more and more. And also there's been some work done, and particularly in Dublin, to encourage peregrine, because they can be a great way then of, I suppose keeping the likes of gulls away or pigeons away, at areas where they might be problematic. So this is work carried out by a colleague of mine, Barry Nolan, putting up purpose-built nest boxes for peregrine, and this has been huge. It's kind of only getting started in Ireland really, but it's been hugely successful in other countries, and particularly in urban areas. And and with that as well brings a lot of opportunities. That to use nest cameras, live feed nest cameras on these sites, and with that as well adds a certain level of protection. So when we know when we know where the birds are, we can monitor them. That allows us to ensure that the nests are safeguarded. And then obviously the site in question, and I'm only just learning myself about this. I've obviously seen a lot online, and from talking to Paul and to Peter Farrell and some of the other locals there that have been watching the birds, and it sounds like it's an amazing site to watch them. And I suppose, as Paul mentioned, it became a situation that word started to spread about them, about the birds, nesting here. And I think the safest peregrine sites are either the ones that absolutely nobody knows about, or that the ones that everybody knows about. And I think that it's fair to say now that this site is in the latter category, and then that becomes hopefully a case that the birds are protected because all the locals are invested, and they're monitoring. They're the custodians of the birds, and hopefully that is the situation, or at least will develop into that situation in Trim. So for those of you that aren't familiar with the site, this is where it's located, and just to give you an idea of so literally right at the edge of Trim. Even though I'm not familiar with it, it's funny. I was saying to Paul, I was in Trim a few years back, just at the tail end of the breeding season. It was probably about 2015, 2016. And as soon as I saw the building, I recognised it, because I actually, when I was there, I saw a peregrine sitting up top of the building, and that was quite a few years back. So I'm delighted to hear that they have nested this year, and that they've nested successfully. And thanks to Peter Farrell, I'm sure he's on this session. He sent me this photo. He seems to have the best view of the bird. So this is the view of the building from his back garden. And I think he's facing the two deck chairs in the wrong direction. But apart from that, what a spectacular view! And he was kind enough to share as well some of the views that he's actually had, and from a very set back distance. So no I'm very careful not to cause any disturbance to the birds. But those of you that haven't seen them or haven't seen these images online, this is some of the footage that Peter has taken of the birds, the adults here, which you can see. And isn't it just amazing to be able to witness this, from your back garden, or to be able to go and see this, in a at the edge of a town in an urban area. And then this is one of the juveniles, and you can see the juveniles much browner in coloration, you can see, and before they developed the adult plumage. So very very easy to tell them apart. And I think at this stage now they're starting to move further afield, starting to essentially learn how to be peregrine, starting to hunt for themselves, and then they're going to be soon in dispersal mode, and they could end up, they might stay relatively local, or they might move a county over, but hopefully the adults will return, and will will breed again next year. So fantastic to have them there, all hugely positive, and what an opportunity to to appreciate them, to go and watch them, but also as well we have to be mindful of some of the pressures that remain, and some of the risks, I suppose, that there are. And unfortunately, as much as we try, the persecution of raptors is still a serious issue in Ireland, and despite efforts, it's still happening. And I think we have to be realistic as well, that it's still happening, but we only really are aware, or know about a small proportion of what's happening out there, the tip of the iceberg. and there has been efforts recently through the Raptor protocol to record incidents and investigate incidents of persecution of raptors, and also hopefully that'll go a step further with the establishment of a new wildlife crime unit, in National Parks and Wildlife Service, which will hopefully be in operation soon, and which will increase collaboration and communication with the Gardaí, and hopefully that's a step forward for us, kind of showing that we're taking this a lot more seriously. But unfortunately, it still happens, and unfortunately, peregrines are one of the species that are specifically targeted by those that want to have raptors, essentially. And there's been some really horrific incidents in the past and in the recent past of persecution of peregrine falcons, both through poisoning and through and with birds being shot as well. And one of the first clips that I mentioned, or that I showed in the first pair that I mentioned, was these at a quarry in Dublin. And I remember at the time when I heard, it was absolutely incredibly infuriated. But at the time that I was spending a bit of time at this site, that same year, just a little bit later after I was there was an attempted poisoning of these birds, whereby there was pigeons were laced with poison and tethered, essentially tied to the ground underneath the nest. So very, very terrible. It was just at the time when the young birds were learning to fly and starting to hunt for themselves. And obviously, pigeon on the ground would have been, very, very enticing for them. Thankfully, it was found. The pigeon was found and removed, and it didn't result in a persecution incident, thankfully, in that year. But it just goes to show what's happening out there, and particularly, and this site was quite a public site. There's people, there, frequently walking, but yet this persecution incident was still attempted. And as I say, that thankfully the bird survived, but there's been many where unfortunately that hasn't been the case. This is another site that I'm familiar with. It's in Tipperary, and I'm sure some of you heard of this incident a few years back, whereby the female, this is the adult female here, was shot while they had chicks in the nest, and nearby a male was shot but survived. The female obviously died. This male was shot through the wing, couldn't fly again, had to be taken into to care by Animal Magic. So absolutely, it's horrendous, and just the as well, like we at the time that they have chicks in the nest. Probably one of the most high profile persecution incidents, and one which resulted in a prosecution. One of the few that has resulted in a prosecution was one down Waterford a few years back, and it happened in 2014 and was brought to court a couple of years later in 2016. And thanks to the mammoth efforts of a ranger at the time, Brian Duffy, who went to a huge amount of work, and just shows you, what's involved in building a case and building a body of evidence to bring an incident like this to court. But absolutely sterling work done by Brian, but again, just terrific circumstances, and all too common. A pigeon brought into a quarry where peregrines were nesting, laced with the poison, tethered to the ground, and again, obviously, that's only going to go in one direction, and that was this. You can see one of the adults there, very fast-acting poisons, incredibly toxic. Obviously targeted at the peregrines, but they can affect whatever comes into contact with these poisons, and it killed the peregrines, and also killed a male sparrowhawk, as you can see here. Did result in a prosecution and fines, but quite small fines. So I suppose it's important to be aware of, and that it does happen. It's continuing to happen, but also as well, that we it's to focus on the positives. And as I said, at a site like this where the birds are so well known, so publicly visible, that that's one of the best places that peregrines can be. And to see people get invested in the birds, and it's like that really helps to safeguard the site. And you can see again another image by Peter. You can see they almost look like they'll have particular perches that they use time and time again. Can almost look like a gargoyle, sitting up on the on a prominent stone or prominent perch. And they are such amazing birds to watch. And as long as it can be done without disturbing the birds, then it's just it's an absolute privilege to watch. And I didn't go into too much detail about watching them, but I'm sure that'll come up over the course of the Q&A and of the discussion, and wherever else whatever other direction we may go in. So now open it up. Hopefully I managed to keep true to my word and stay relatively oh God, maybe I didn't. It's 20 days already. So
no, it's grand. Thanks very much for that, John.